Opening the center creates immediate central pawn tension and prepares piece development. Developing the knight immediately prepares for central pawn breaks and challenges white's initial territorial claim. Asserting central control and challenging black's nf6, c4 now dictates the early pawn structure and fight for space. Embracing the Fianchetto often signals a long-term positional vision, preparing to launch pieces from the flank. Opening the Fianchetto diagonal, white prepares the bishop's influence, aiming to control central dark squares and potentially pressure black's kingside pawn structure. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal solidifies control of the center and prepares for kingside castling, embracing a flexible setup. Solidifying the Fianchetto, this piece eyes the long diagonal, preparing for central expansion and aiming to disrupt black's kingside structure should it materialize. Securing the king promptly is paramount, creating a safe haven for the monarch while preparing for future central actions. Developing the knight here fortifies the center and prepares for potential queenside expansion, subtly restricting black's bishop. Solidifying the center, d6 prepares to challenge white's pawn mass while reinforcing the knight's influence. Unlocking the kingside pawn chain with a knight now firmly planted on f3 solidifies white's central control and prepares for an eventual e4 push, while simultaneously offering a safe haven for the knight should black attempt to disrupt the center with moves like c5 or e5. Developing the knight to c6 offers a fluid connection, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn pushes like e5. This squares the knight away, allowing for participation in both kingside and queenside play should the opportunity arise, without immediately overextending. Securing the king behind a wall of pawns and knights signifies a commitment to solid positional development, a prudent choice after a standard opening. Boldly challenging the center, this pawn thrust immediately injects central tension, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially open lines for black's pieces, while creating interesting pawn structures that will dictate future play. 8d5 immediately injects spatial tension, forcing black's knight to a less active square and defining the center's structure for the coming middle game. Embracing the pawn chain, e7 nudges towards the kingside, a subtle repositioning that might later support a fianchettoed bishop or a knight sortie. This knight's relocation acknowledges the central pawn structure's rigidity, signaling a patient, positional maneuver rather than an immediate tactical thrust. Smashing through the center, white aims to dismantle black's pawn chain and establish a lasting queenside majority, potentially creating a passed pawn down the c-file if black isn't careful with their king's safety and piece development. Challenging the central pawn chain, black reroutes his knight, aiming to reinforce his queenside and potentially contest the d5 outpost, a subtle but vital piece of maneuvering to break white's spatial advantage. Unlocking the c-file with this capture immediately challenges black's kingside control and offers a tangible route for your rook to become active, potentially creating dynamic play and disrupting the pawn structure. Opening up the c-file could be a double-edged sword, potentially giving your opponent attacking chances along it while also liberating your own pieces. White proactively shores up the queenside, preventing black from developing their pieces or pawns to that flank and preparing a potential queenside expansion with b4 later on. Liberating the knight to c5 aims to disrupt white's central control and put pressure on the queenside, potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or even a bold central thrust if white isn't careful. Pushing the knight to d2 aims to reroute it towards the kingside, potentially supporting a future g4 push and creating a strong outpost for it on f3 or h3, while simultaneously clearing the path for the queen to potentially join the attack or defend the queenside. Exploring the queenside flank opens up potential for active piece play, aiming to challenge white's pawn structure and potentially create outposts for black's knights on c5 and further down the board. This move initiates a strategic dialogue regarding control of the c-file and prepares for potential pawn breaks in the future, while also subtly reinforcing the nc5. The thrust of this pawn seeks to rupture the pawn chain and immediately contest control over the central squares, particularly d5, while simultaneously launching an offensive on the queenside. Bringing the knight to b7 aims to reinforce the queenside and potentially create a bridge for a kingside attack, while subtly acknowledging the space white has established on the queenside with the pawn advance. Shifting the queen to the queenside initiates a coordinated assault, aiming to exploit the structural weaknesses on that flank while indirectly pressuring the knight on b7. Developing the bishop to its active diagonal aims to exert pressure along the b7h1 diagonal, potentially challenging white's queen and preparing to support the knight's advance or eventual sortie from the flank. Opening the diagonal for the bishop to eye the queenside and apply pressure on the b6 pawn is a proactive approach, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure before it solidifies. Black shores up that potentially weak b7 square, preventing any immediate pawn pushes from white, but it's a rather passive maneuver that concedes further central control and doesn't address the growing pressure along the kingside. Targeting the weak knight on b7, this knight maneuver sets up a potential squeeze, aiming to exploit black's somewhat cramped position and perhaps gain control of crucial diagonals for future attacks. Challenging the queenside pawn chain, this thrust aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on a8. Shifting the knight back to d2 aims to bolster the d-pawn's defense, an important pawn given the kingside pawn structure. This repositioning also prepares for a potential knight maneuver via c4 or even b3 to contest black's queenside expansion, subtly creating counterplay where black has invested significant pawn pushes. Black seeks to unburden the queenside by initiating a queenside expansion, aiming to challenge white's advanced pawns and potentially open lines for the rooks, while also preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square. Shifting the bishop to the long diagonal solidifies the kingside and prepares to contest control of the open files, creating new tactical possibilities. A bold gambit is initiated, aiming to disrupt white's solid pawn chain and open crucial lines for black's pieces, potentially creating attacking opportunities against the castled king by challenging the center's control. Unleashing the rook to the third rank, this maneuver seeks to exploit the somewhat exposed position of black's king and potentially activate a queenside battery along the file, simultaneously preparing for a potential pawn push with b5 to challenge black's advanced knight on c5. Black repositions the bishop to a diagonal that pressures white's queenside pawn structure and potentially targets the vulnerable kingside. White finally anchors the kingside pawn chain, reinforcing the e4 square and preparing to contest the crucial central dark squares, while also subtly suggesting a potential kingside expansion later. Rack 8 immediately seeks to activate the rook along the potentially open c-file, challenging white's queenside pawn structure and aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces, which currently feels a bit cramped. Opening the file creates a dynamic confrontation, forcing black to decide whether to maintain pawn structure or embrace an unbalanced position. Embracing the open lines, black decisively captures the pawn, immediately activating the queenside thrust and demanding white's immediate attention to the newly formed diagonal. Re-establishing queen pressure on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the now open file. Relocating the bishop back to g7 might seem like a retreat, but it skillfully repositions the piece to defend the weakened dark squares around the castled king, a crucial defensive maneuver given white's queenside pressure. Reclaiming the a-file by attacking the rook on c8 immediately creates dynamic pressure, forcing black to react and potentially disrupting their pawn structure on the queenside. This repositioning of the rook from a defensive square to an aggressive, attacking posture signals a shift towards more active play and opens up possibilities for a swift initiative. A bold thrust, pushing the pawn forward to disrupt white's queenside structure and inject immediate activity into the center. This gambit of space for initiative aims to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the rooks, while simultaneously cramping white's knight on c4 and potentially creating weaknesses around the white king if white isn't careful with their pawn advances. Shifting the bishop to f1 subtly reinforces the kingside pawn structure and prepares for a potential kingside attack, while also freeing the g2 bishop to pursue a more active role, perhaps on the long diagonal or to support a central pawn push. Repositioning the knight from its initially passive square to g7, this maneuver aims to bypass the crowded center and potentially redeploy to a more active diagonal, perhaps eyeing the kingside or supporting a pawn thrust further into white's territory. It also frees up the f6 square, hinting at future piece coordination and perhaps a more dynamic kingside defense or even an offensive build-up. Challenging the queenside pawn chain and seeking to activate the rook on an open file, this move aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed position and potentially open lines for attack. Recognizing the pressure building on the queenside, black seeks to redeploy their queen to a more active square, aiming to bolster the defense of the kingside while simultaneously preparing for potential counterplay. The white rook's audacious leap to the 7th rank immediately injects a potent dose of aggression, aiming to pry open the queenside and potentially disrupt black's king's safety by targeting the weak pawns and creating advanced outposts. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank directly challenges white's aggressive pawn structure on the queenside and aims to disrupt the pressure being built by the rooks. This proactive repositioning seeks to unlock the pieces and prepare for counterplay on the queenside, potentially forcing concessions from white's advanced pawns or creating attacking chances against the exposed white king. Sacrificing a rook on an open file fundamentally reshapes the tactical landscape, opening avenues for the queen and bishop while inviting a cascade of forced exchanges that could simplify into a favorable endgame for white, provided the king remains secure. The repositioning of the queen to an active central square, threatening the newly established rook battery on the c-file, signifies a shift towards tactical engagement. This response directly challenges white's aggressive queen placement, aiming to disrupt their coordinated attack and potentially exploit any weaknesses created by the rook's advanced position. Black's intention is likely to simplify the position or force an exchange that relieves the pressure on their kingside. Seizing the opportunity created by black's recent exchanges, white strategically isolates and attacks the weak b-pawn, a crucial outpost that had been supporting black's queenside structure. This capture not only removes a defensive piece, but also opens up lines for white's remaining pieces, particularly the rook on the file, potentially leading to increased pressure on black's position. The pawn structure around black's king remains relatively solid, but the loss of this queenside pawn could create long-term imbalances, forcing black to be constantly vigilant. Reclaiming the bishop on b5 achieves a crucial pawn trade, simplifying the board and potentially easing black's cramped position after white's aggressive rook maneuver. White initiates a forceful capture, shattering the pawn's structure and opening lines that will become critical for a sustained attack on the queenside. This bold exchange is designed to disrupt black's defensive coordination and exploit the newfound space, potentially leading to an initiative that is difficult to contain. A strategic repositioning, the knight retreats to a more secure square, aiming to support the kingside or potentially swing over to the queenside if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously creating a defensive screen for the king and preparing to contest the open c-file. Exchanging the fianchettoed bishop removes a key defender of black's kingside, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Securing the monarch against the looming threats on the kingside, this maneuver re-establishes a defensive bastion, simultaneously preparing to reposition the king to a more active role in the impending endgame skirmishes. Shifting the bishop to the c6 square aims to challenge the pawns on the queenside and potentially disrupt black's defensive structure, forcing a decision about how to respond to this new pressure. Reclaiming a piece through this exchange opens up the knight's defensive duties and introduces an immediate tactical threat to the pawn on f2. Re-establishing pressure on the open c-file, this repositioning of the rook prepares to contest any incursions and adds a vital attacking piece to the center of the board. An attempt to untangle the position and potentially create counterplay by activating the queen, but the hanging pawns on the queenside present a significant structural weakness that might be exploited. Capturing the rook simplifies the position, exchanging queens and heading into a materially balanced but strategically complex endgame, where white's slightly better pawn structure and active rook might offer subtle advantages. Capturing the knight opens a clear path for your rook on the now open file, aiming to disrupt white's central structure and potentially create threats against the king by infiltrating into enemy territory. Securing the 7th rank with this rook repositions it for dominance over an open file, potentially pressuring the opposing king or creating opportunities for a decisive breakthrough later in the game. Bringing the knight back to b5 immediately after the exchange on c7 aims to disrupt white's centralized knight and contest the open b-file, a necessary step given the diminished material and the potential for white's bishop to become a dominant force on the queen side. The rook now aggressively occupies the 7th rank, threatening to cascade down the open file and isolate the knight. The knight's daring leap to c3 unlocks crucial central influence and prepares to disrupt white's already precarious pawn structure on the queen side. The knight's journey to the edge of the board, aiming for a central outpost, signals a desire to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially dominate the queen side. Shifting the king towards the center opens up new possibilities and prepares for the pawn storm ahead, aiming to leverage the open lines created by recent exchanges for activity. Propelling the pawn forward injects immediate life into the position, aiming to dislodge the black knight from its prominent outpost and potentially create a passed pawn later. The knight's repositioning to e5 immediately challenges white's advanced pawn, seeking to disrupt its support and create counterplay on the king side. Clearing the path for the remaining knight to join the assault on the weakened king side, while simultaneously creating an outpost for itself on the 7th rank, a decisive regrouping maneuver. Preserving this passed pawn's advanced position and creating a protected passed pawn on the file are the primary objectives now, with the rook providing crucial defensive support for the isolated knight. This pawn thrust initiates a bold endgame maneuver, aiming to tie down black's pieces and potentially exploit the weak light squares on the queen side while advancing the passed pawn. The king's trek into the heart of the battlefield, while audacious, exposes a critical vulnerability to white's rook on the 7th rank, potentially leading to a swift and decisive material loss. This repositioning aims to activate the rook, threatening to create further mischief on the 7th rank and potentially forcing concessions from black's awkwardly placed pieces. Reclaiming the central pawn immediately, black seeks to disrupt white's rook activity and re-establish some pawn presence, but this will invite further complications with white's knights poised for an attack. Pawn advances like this often unleash a strategic surprise, aiming to disrupt the opponent's defensive structure and gain crucial space for active pieces, potentially forcing concessions or opening new avenues for attack. Dislodging that knight from its protected outpost on c3, which has been so influential in stifling white's queenside expansion, is a crucial step, aiming to inject some dynamism into black's position and potentially disrupt white's coordination. Reclaiming the open file after black's speculative pawn thrust offers a vital respite, consolidating white's material advantage and preparing to exploit the exposed enemy monarch. Unleashing the rook to disrupt white's well-formed pawn structure, this gambit offers dynamic counterplay and aims to exploit the slightly misplaced knight on a4. Securing that isolated pawn is paramount now, as it represents a significant advantage that should be consolidated. Suddenly, the black king finds itself awkwardly placed, exposed to immediate danger as the rook makes a daring foray. The king awkwardly shuffles forward, a desperate attempt to escape the encroaching pawns, but its exposed position on the open file now offers little refuge. Introducing a powerful knight excursion to the king side, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the weakened f2 square, potentially creating mating threats.